Okay, folks, it is lovely to see the black boxes with your names on it. I wish I could actually see all of your lovely faces. I want to thank you so much for joining us today for the Women, Peace and Security Dialogue, Femme, Paix et Sécurité, report back on civil society voices on Canada's next Women, Peace and National Action Plan. My name is Jo Rodriguez. I am a coach for humanitarian aid and international development workers. I am a proud member of this network. I'm also a trainer for equity, diversity, inclusion, and gender inclusion, and I am your moderator for today. I'm logging in from the land known as Toronto, the land which is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. And the philosophy behind this treaty is that everyone who lives here also shares the land and protects the land. Now, we're going to go over a brief logistics, but while we're doing that, we'd love to see in the chat box where everybody is logging in from. So a short introduction from yourselves, as well as land acknowledgements. And so, yeah, if you can drop that in the chat box, I will read a couple of them over once we've gone through a little bit of logistics. So Monique, let's have the slide for the interpretation. Fantastic. So if you need interpretation, please use the Zoom toolbar and click interpretation and choose either English or French. And if you require the captions in the menu bar, choose the CC Live transcript and choose Show Subtitle to see the captions across the bottom of the screen, or choose View Full Transcript to see them in a separate panel. And let me just see what we've got in the chat. Okay, perhaps it's just taking a moment for us to get the updates on introductions there. So I'll give you another moment to quickly type in where you're logging in from and a short introduction of who you are. Oh, I see. So we have some people who've, Monique, it looks like people can't open the chat box. It seems to be, and okay, it seems to be enabled now. Lovely. Thank you. And so what I'm going to do, just again to give us a little bit of time, is I'm going to actually introduce the network. And then I'm going to go back because I do want to see where everybody's logging in from, and to do a little bit of a shout out to everyone. So thanks again for bearing with us with the slight technical difficulty, and we'll come back to those introductions in a moment. So the Women, Peace and Security Network is a network of over 80 Canadian non-governmental organizations and individuals who are committed to promoting and monitoring the efforts of the Government of Canada to implement and support the United Nations Security Council resolutions on women, peace, and security. The network is also a forum. It provides a forum to exchange and for action by the Canadian civil society on issues related to women, peace, and security. So we have those two functions of the network. So as I go back to the chat box, I see that we have some people from civil society, like Iman from Canadian Peace Initiative, and Megan from the unceded lands of the Coast Salish peoples, Karen Breck, Women Veteran Engagement Network from Ottawa, Joy Hurst from Edmonton, Canadian Federation of University Women. Let's see. We have some people from Quebec and Gatineau working primarily, Marissa's primarily working on the NAP in Defense Ukraine, as well as CRSV. And I can see that there's a lot of people also logging in from our federal government bodies. So that's fantastic. Thank you. So what I wanted to do is to share with you what the objective of today's session is. And part of it is actually to launch the report on the civil society voices on Canada's next Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan, as well as to share key findings. And so how we're going to do this is I'm just going to briefly go over the agenda with you. Monique, if you can shift the slide, fantastic. So we've done our welcome and opening remarks. We will have a brief introduction to the CNAP. This will be followed by a discussion on the dialogue process as well as the inputs received. And after that, we're going to have an overview of the report and key recommendations, followed by responses and remarks from Canada's Women, Peace and Security Ambassador. And after that, we will have a Q&A session where you will be able to share your questions and receive responses from the author of the report, in addition to the ambassador and a representative of the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada. So at any point, the best way to get your questions for us to see them is to use the Q&A box. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties or wish to just share your aha moments or reflections, please use the chat. And with that, the last thing, two last little points here is during the session, as you're having those aha moments, please feel free to tweet those or post them on social media using the hashtag WPS Dialogue FPS. We'd love for not only the engagement here, but for us to get some momentum moving on social media to get people excited about reviewing this report once we've launched it. So in advance, thank you for that. We're going to ask now if you can participate in a poll. And this poll is just to support us in gathering some information about who's in attendance today, whether you're in government, civil society, inside or outside of Canada, and if you were participating in the dialogue process. So if you could just take a moment to answer these three questions, that'd be fantastic. And as we're doing that, just want to thank Sandra for also throwing into the chat box for those who find it easier to read the description about the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada. Thank you, Sandra. And I'm just checking in with Monique to see if we can have, there we go, the published results. So 31% is of the participants today are government, 69% civil society, and inside Canada we have an attendance of 87%, and outside of Canada 13%. For those who are logging outside of Canada, welcome and thank you for joining us as well. And did you participate in the dialogues? 51% here did. That's fantastic to see. Okay, so we are now going to get an introduction of the Canadian National Action Plan from Beth Warnick, who is the Vice President Policy at the Equality Fund, as well as the chair of the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada. And while she's not here today in person, she has recorded this info for us to hear today. Thank you.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Hello everyone. I'm very sorry that I cannot be with you today to share in this discussion of the Women, Peace and Security, Femmes, Paix et Sécurité dialogues. Unfortunately, I have to settle for this video, recorded on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. It was very exciting to see the depth of interest and the range of recommendations, suggestions, and ideas raised during the online discussions. I'm very grateful to all who participated and especially thankful for the CNAP 3 working group led by our chair Katrina Leclerc and wonderfully supported by our Women, Peace and Security Network coordinator Monique Cuillerier. It falls to me this afternoon to provide a little context. As most of you on this webinar know, Canada's second National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, or CNAP, as we affectionately call it, is drawing to a close. Launched almost 5 years ago, CNAP 2 was a strong step forward. At the time, there was excitement regarding the political support behind the plan. It was launched by then Minister for Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland, and had 6 additional ministers signing and making commitments. It was grounded in a clearer understanding of how gender inequalities, identities, roles, and relations interact with conflict, security, and peace building. And it outlined the essential role played by civil society, especially women-led organizations, both in Canada and around the world. Of course, as civil society at the time, we also had critiques. We urged greater policy coherence and attention to women, peace, and security priorities across all foreign policy areas. Resource investments and dedicated budgets were also a priority, as well as clear reporting on results and challenges. If you haven't had a look already, I recommend you check out the publications on the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada website for more analysis and recommendations. Since 2017, we've welcomed the appointment and work of Canada's Women, Peace and Security Ambassador Jackie O'Neill and Canada's leadership in pushing for gender equality language in various international discussions. We've supported the Women, Peace and Security Advisory Group, a forum that brings Canadian civil society organizations, representatives of Indigenous women's organizations, together with Government of Canada officials working on CNAP implementation. We've applauded the ELSI initiative, a now global initiative to increase the number of women serving in UN peacekeeping missions, and new funding for women peace builders. However, we've also raised concerns. We hear from women peace builders that little is changing on the ground, that women continue to be excluded from many peace processes and negotiations. Afghanistan, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the long-standing issue of sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces, including at the highest levels, and increasing military budgets all raise challenges for Canada's Women, Peace and Security agenda. In 2020, the government made a commitment to release a paper on Canada's feminist foreign policy. We're still waiting. As well, new challenges and issues for the next National Action Plan have emerged. These include incorporating domestic issues into Canada's National Action Plan, better understanding of how the climate crisis, gender equality issues, and security are intertwined, and ensuring both a decolonizing and anti-racist perspectives in women, peace, and security work, to name just a few. So this is part of the context for the discussions and deliberations on Canada's next Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan. The dialogues we're discussing today are a rich input and provide much for our government colleagues to work with as they prepare CNAP 3. We know it is not an easy task, and the expectations are high. However, it is crucial that we get this right. It is now 22 years since the first Women, Peace and Security resolution was passed in the UN Security Council. The crises in our world today call out for truly feminist solutions, and activists around the world are looking for Canadian leadership in word, investments, and in deeds.
All right. Well, it's always a little sobering, right? To hear the context that we're in which we're having this conversation, but also a good reminder of why it is so important for us to meet this way and to discuss, for example, what we're going to be discussing just now. And with that, I want to introduce you to Katrina Leclerc. Katrina is a member of the Women, Peace and Security Network Steering Committee, as well as the chair of the network's CNAP 3 working group. So Katrina, it is lovely to see you today. We're about to launch this report, and as a result of the dialogue process, I would love to know what stood out the most throughout this process of dialogue?
Thank you so much, Joe, for the introduction and for agreeing to moderate our wonderful report back event today. I'm glad to be here and grateful to be calling in from Tsawwassen First Nation territory on the West Coast, where it is my home. Je souhaite aussi remercier sincèrement les membres du groupe de travail du Plan d'action national, troisième version, du réseau Femmes, Paix, Sécurité Canada, pour le travail que nous avons effectué ensemble au cours des 6 derniers mois et même avant ça, et qui continuera, je suis certaine, après cet événement d'aujourd'hui. What stood out to me, or at least what stood out and will be reflected and is reflected in the report, are two primary thematic areas that we heard from civil society across Canada and from outside of Canada, some of which were also participating in the dialogue process. The first is this consistent need and demand to strengthen feminist ambition, goals, and approaches on the Canadian National Action Plan. So what we heard very much that stood out in terms of this is that the ambition and scope of CNAP 3 should reflect Canadian leadership in feminist foreign policy, as Beth mentioned in her video. Participants strongly believed that intersectionality must be a foundational principle of the CNAP 3 and operationalized in a way that commits to addressing the overlapping nature of discrimination in many cases for several individuals and communities. The focus, of course, is on women, given the women, peace, and security agenda, but women in all of their diversity should be reflected and included. This includes attention to how issues of sexual diversity and identity come into play, the different ability or disability that individuals experience in their daily lives. Of course, identity in terms of indigeneity, age, class, race, religion, and other factors that change the way that we experience our different contexts. Further, it was also very much recommended that Canada pay a closer attention to women peace builders particularly, and of course, women human rights defenders also. So to strengthen this commitment to a feminist foreign policy and improve also training on women, peace, and security among Government of Canada staff to be able to support women peace builders and human rights defenders abroad, for example, but even more so in our own country. That was another thing that stood out. And a second thing that stood out, particularly in terms of a theme, was about this policy coherence. That, as we saw in some of the quotes when the event started, many of our participants who joined us in this dialogue process made an emphasis on this cohesive and coherent policy that should be a priority across all Government of Canada policies. So to have a whole of government, and even more so a whole of nation approach to ensure that all of the departments are on the same page when it comes to women, peace, and security, and at a high degree of interdepartmental cooperation that we'd like to see as civil society, which is encouraged or was highly encouraged throughout the process. And ideally, women, peace, and security objectives will also be integrated consistently across all of Canadian departments and agencies, which will be hopefully implementing the CNAP cohesively. And of course, new and emerging or revised Canadian policy should be mutually reinforcing as well, with consistency with both the question of the international and the domestic agenda, which are of course critical.
So like just really easy peasy stuff, not
just a few little things to throw out there, right?
Yeah, and I think what I'm hearing from you, like the thing that kind of stood out as you're sharing this with us is like that overall theme of like we need to be even more inclusive. It's like even more inclusive, and I'm also hearing this requires even delving into understanding more as well as cooperating more, like a lot of more is what I'm hearing. So this is very interesting to hear that this is what you pulled out from the dialogue process. What I'd love to learn now, and I think everybody else would love to hear, is what areas did people have like the most diverse views on?
Yes, thank you so much. And of course, we had a lot of diversity, and I'll speak about the demographics of our actual participants who joined us in the dialogue in a few minutes. But we did have a lot of diverse views and experiences shared throughout the last 6 months where we held these consultative discussions. And so this is actually two word clouds that I wanted us to be able to look at quickly from the discussions that we held. We held some private and some public discussions, and some of the themes that we asked participants to share with us about what they thought were priority themes, emerging themes. These are some that stood out. So you could see that there's such a diversity of perspectives, priorities, and also issues that are emerging in the WPS space through these word cloud images that represent a lot of this diverse view. But there are also two other diversity of views that I want to highlight. So the first is focusing more broadly on refocusing the question of peace in the word or in the terminology of women, peace, and security. So we heard a lot about prioritizing, for example, disarmament and the prevention of all forms of violence, which was, of course, the concern for many participants. Recommendations included greater focus on domestic violence, particularly, for example, in Canada, reassessing arms exports and other component of Canada's military economy, and moving towards a peace economy rather than focusing on the military spending that Canada does do to a certain extent. And that includes, for several participants, the signing of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Another more thematic, diverse view that kind of stood out or came out of the dialogue process was with regard to bringing a feminist lens to the question of security in women, peace, and security. So what does that mean? And what does that mean to civil society? And so in line with feminist thinking, what came out to us or what we saw in this diversity of views is that the CNAP-3 definition of security should be widened. So the plan should include attention to emerging security threats, such as climate justice, and cybersecurity as well. And of course, in this post or even during COVID time, I don't want to jinx it by saying we're already out of the woods, but nonetheless, this cybersecurity component became very predominant in the conversations in addition to the climate justice component. There's also a better understanding of this so-called nexus between climate, women, peace, and security, and gender equality. And what does that mean in terms of, for example, engaging Environment and Climate Change Canada? So maybe having their department be a signatory, of course, to this next CNAP, which they were not in the previous version. Likewise, it was frequently recognized that cybersecurity is a transnational issue, that it affects women in Canada and around the world, of course. And I don't think we want to debate that, but it's important to understand how the gender norms contribute to the weaponization of social media, for example, and how the safety and security of women peace builders, activists, and human rights defenders are under threat in the online spaces, and often that translates to in-person or vice versa. There's also a need that came out to address persistent barriers of women who use information and communication technologies for peace-building purposes, and that there's a need to resolve the heightened exclusion or invisibility of those who are not online, especially those who have not been able to adapt or have access to either the technology or the internet or the data to be able to adapt to online and the shift to the online world that COVID required of many of us.
You know, again, what you're raising that came out of these dialogues, out of the process, like in terms of those diverse views, is actually like questioning the process, right? Which makes sense, right? We started with really good intentions at the very beginning, but there's also been enough time now with CNAP 1, CNAP 2, and CNAP 3 to actually go, how's it working? Has this been enough, right? And what aim is being satisfied right now? And what something else you're pointing out through the diverse views that you received was that things are evolving, right? We're not like kind of like stuck in a status quo. Things have evolved to a point where when we had that first CNAP, were we thinking about the cybersecurity as a transnational issue? Were we thinking about, you know, climate, gender equality, and women, peace, and security the way we are now? Of course not, right? So what I'm finding very powerful about the dialogues is that it's raised right up to the surface, the nature of the process, which is we need to stop and ask some questions so we can be effective. We can meet that aim. that apparently we have to redefine actually. So thank you so much for that. So what would you say through the process of these dialogues, what did the dialogue showcase for you, like from your perspective?
Well, the dialogue showcased a lot of things, and as people will see with the report, we have formatted it in 8 primary themes, of which I'm pulling from for some of these answers right now. But 3 of these themes are themes that I want to kind of highlight in my response. The first is in terms of strengthening and providing clarity on this question of domestic agenda. We've been seeing an emerging trend in civil society within Canada, pushing for more of a domestic focus to our National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. And so CNAP 3, from what we've heard, should include a broad definition of security and also pay attention to conflict and injustice happening inside our own country. For example, immediately prioritizing reconciliation and decolonization was consistently highlighted as one of the areas of critical importance, including by implementing, for example, the 231 calls for justice from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and also, of course, the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. Likewise, there was a high importance that was further placed on integrating and operationalizing the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, and also the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, which actually celebrated another anniversary earlier this week or a few days ago. And further, something else that really came out is this need to address this racism and to face the fact that there is a racism and discrimination problem in our own country, and that CNAP is a tool to tackle in one ways, there are several ways, some of these injustices and discriminations individuals are facing. In terms of the domestic agenda as well, there were several recommendations which I want to highlight that are about the implementation and looking at the Arbor report, which also needs to be implemented to make the Canadian Armed Forces themselves a safe work environment for everyone. Something else, kind of a more thematic area that came out, was this dedication of resources. And this is always a big question in women, peace and security spaces and peace building, or even any type of work in this area. Of course, the question of the money and dedicating resources and time to objectives, indicators, and activities. All of these lesser fancy or lesser sexy themes, let's say. And so some things that came out of our conversation in terms of how to, what was showcased, or what I want to showcase, is in terms of dedicating funds, costing and budgeting, for example, our National Action Plan as an actual dedicated activity to be able to see what concrete activities and goals are necessary for the CNAP, not only the broad pictures, having feminist funded practices, such as flexible, long-term, and rapid response fundings being required to support the work of women peace builders, women human rights defenders, and those who are working in conflict prevention, humanitarian response, state building, and even recovery. Something else that stood out before I hand it back to you is in terms of strengthening Government of Canada links with non-governmental actors in Canada and in conflict-affected countries, of course. So for CNAP 3 to be successful and of course make meaningful change, collaboration on the formulation and implementation of women, peace and security is necessary. So many participants highlighted that the Government of Canada needs to actively engage women and LGBTQIA+ activists, peace builders, and human rights defenders to ensure that we meet the duties of care so as to not jeopardize the safety of these individual activists and these groups, including through supporting, for example, asylum seekers who are in Canada. It was also recommended that the government sustain and build on its engagement with civil society to achieve its goals, knowing and acknowledging that there have been very many advances and that there have been positive strides forward with the last CNAP, for example. But of course, that to be able to work with civil society needs to be built up and needs to be supported. And that also means through funding that is adequate and sustainable.
Okay, so what you're sharing again is, it's inspiring, it's a bit scary, right? Because what you're saying is you're asking us to, broaden this definition of security, which, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people or like, never mind. But what you're also sharing that has come out of the dialogue is that there are consequences and risks to not broadening these definitions, and there are consequences and risks of not really listening to these diverse groups, or taking recommendations that the National Truth and Reconciliation Group, as well as the Missing and Murdered Women and Indigenous Girls and Missing and Murdered Women and Girls group, they spent so much time and effort to write down things that can be pulled. They're literally recommendations you can pull that are actionable, and to miss the opportunity is in some ways will have a negative reaction or a negative impact on the very thing that everyone here is working so hard for. And the one of the last things I wanted to kind of pull from what you said is the importance of money. Because that, for example, and I'm making this point this way to really hit something. But when you go to the grocery store, you have a list, and money goes to each item. And if it's not on the list, you're not spending money on it, right? So it's sometimes having that clarity of being able to see, like, here's what we want to knock out of the park, and here's the budget that goes with it. And so this is what I'm hearing, that, what has come out of these dialogues is exactly what you've just shared. So thanks once again. And I think where I would like to land, end this, is to ask, what are some unanswered questions that remain?
Yeah, there, of course, a lot of the conversations were very fruitful, and there were a lot of suggestions, recommendations that came out, but we also have some unanswered questions, of course, some things that individuals were not necessarily all agreeing on, or that we kind of threw out there as discussion points, and we didn't land on concrete recommendations or a unified front on this. And this is something that demonstrates also the continuing and emerging growth of the Women, Peace, and Security framework as a whole. And so one thing that came out is in terms of the accountability and the reporting. And we've seen this as a challenge in CNAP too. And so what we heard and what we are seeing, and this is questions and discussions that our wonderful governmental counterparts and colleagues will need to dive into more, and that we're happy to continue that conversation. But really, the clear, timely, and consistent, transparent reporting for CNAP 3 is a must. It's imperative. But how do we do that is still something that remains a big question. So part of the discussions, or what we heard on this front, is that this reporting includes needing to make progress reports, for example, available in a timely manner, for them to be relevant and useful. Having all of these bureaucratic delays, which I know are not the fault of anyone in particular, may mean that some of this reporting is more challenging for civil society to be able to use these tools, or even other government departments to use these tools to continue to grow, because we know that the National Action Plan, although a written document, is a continually changing document. It shouldn't be set in stone necessarily. So for example, this progress report question, which we discussed very much, is also about needing to provide clear information on progress and challenges, also acknowledging what isn't working and what needs to maybe change, even if the plan is set for a certain amount of time. And of course, going beyond anecdotal lists of initiatives, and ideally reporting will also include something about information on how women, peace, and security goals are operationalized. Reporting on funding was also a question about how did we do this? How do we make sure, what do we recommend to do so that it can have the importance, or at least that the actual reporting is functional to the importance that it should have. And indicator clarity was also a big question of something that folks were not sure how to recommend, or that there was not a consensus on, in terms of how do these indicators set clear goals and make sure that we are able to evaluate and reevaluate how these indicators are tracked, for example. So that was also part of the recommended, but also questions that we were left with during this discussion. There were some conversations very briefly about funding, monitoring, and evaluation plans with specific timelines, and how that should maybe be included in CNAP 3 as one of the possible ways to mitigate some of the issues we saw with CNAP 2, but again, very much open to further conversation and seeing what will be useful. Of course, we have such a potential with this next National Action Plan to advance the successful implementation of women, peace, and security, but we have to see how the celebration of the successes of CNAP2, but also the identification of the gaps that remain need certain improvement. And so this was one of these questions that came out. And we also really struggled to some extent on how do you actually operationalize intersectionality? How do you make intersectionality in a feminist foreign policy, in a Canadian National Action Plan, actually not only be pen to paper? How do you make sure that that goes through all of the departments, goes through the implementation, and reflects in civil society and on the ground? And another thing, just to kind of a small example, that was the question about priority countries. So several conversations were had about this because Canada right now has identified priority countries which they have funding for to support externally. But is that the way to go? Is that helpful? Does that change with the times? Does that act? And some folks in the dialogue didn't agree with each other. Some said, you know, the priority countries issue is a great idea because it means that there's consistency in funding and support to local peace builders in those regions, even if they're not the hot topics of the day. But in others, they said, but it limits what ability we have to change funding and what civil society can, for example, request for funding for based on the emerging issues and conflicts that we see and cannot anticipate. So we don't have all of the answers, even after, of course, this dialogue process. But to say that we have started this conversation about what these critical questions are, and I think a lot of the participants, and I think I can speak on behalf of the network, are very excited to see where these conversations go and to continue this dialogue beyond only today's presentation.
Oh, okay. So what I want to take away from what you've just said and, acknowledge is the government stakeholders throughout this process, they have, we've reported and shared our feedback in so many different ways over the years. And what I know is that they have gone away and taken some of that back and said, okay, let's rejig this. And so when I hear you saying this, I can imagine someone thinking, but we built plans and we had indicators and we tried to listen to what why are you saying now, like, and what's coming out of this, what I'm hearing from you is that you're saying, look, there are some barriers. There are still some barriers. So yes, you've followed through to some extent, and yet it's not yielding the expected results that civil society on the ground, here and abroad are expecting. And one of the things that you're naming through, like, that's been noted through the dialogue process is this tension between the structures we have now, which some of them are colonized and are racist, right? And the trying to shift out of that structure into something that looks like a feminist model, which is more flexible and has like this it allows for a little bit of ebb and flow. But the transition is yucky, right? Because you have to get into it and figure it out. And so what you're saying here is these unanswered questions are coming from, I think, what we're seeing nationally and internationally, this like thing of things have to change somehow. It's not going to be easy. And yet, and acknowledging the work that has been done up to date, right? Hard work that's been done. And, right, we can't stop here. So thank you very much for those insights, Katrina. I want to actually just pass the baton right over to you so that you can share an overview of the process and the report.
Thank you so much. I want to make this very brief because we want to hear from our other colleagues as well. But maybe Monique, if you could share with us the slide on the demographics of who we heard from during this process. Because as some of you may know, and of course, those of you who participated with us know this already, this process begun quite a few months ago, and we were able to, with the support of Global Affairs, have some financial contributions to host several activities for this dialogue process. So this started back primarily in March, April, May, and June, where we held the bulk of our consultation processes or dialogue discussions. So the Women, Peace and Security Network organized, in this case, a series of activities seeking civil society input and recommendations into this National Action Plan, which will be our third version. And to ensure accessibility as much as we could, we tried to diversify the methods of the dialogue. The participation could be what we had hoped, as broad as possible. And we did this via several public-facing webinars, private closed-door sessions with those who may have some security or sensitivity concerns. We also had written statements that could be submitted to the website that we created to house all of the dialogue process. We had a survey that was distributed that was anonymous, gave opportunity for feedback in that way, and of course, discussions on social media. So with all of these different components of what we saw and what we were able to put together throughout those few months, we had about 182 people register for these different dialogue sessions that we held. And 162 completed different survey and demographic information. So a decent amount in a short amount of time. And we also wanted to ensure, of course, this linguistic diversity within our country. And so some respondents chose to respond in French. D'autres ont décidé de parler en français, comme à leur guise. And then we, of course, wanted to be able to showcase and see what respondents were from different demographics and different identity factors, including those who identified as Indigenous, either First Nation, Inuit, or Métis. We wanted to also highlight some or understand some different barriers that individuals from the BIPOC community were experiencing that are unique to their community, or add another intersectional layer to the experiences that they face. Of course, we wanted to see and try to reach as much as possible community members from the community living with disabilities and other community members from the LGBTQIA+ community. And these are just a snapshot of some of our demographics that we tried to capture, but all in all, to demonstrate how we tried as much as possible to showcase and reflect the diversity of Canada and of our country, but also to be able to be as inclusive and open as possible. If we switch to the next slide, you'll see just a brief overview, some snapshots of the website that we put together, which we're very proud of, and we hope to continue to keep it active so that this dialogue can continue and that the National Action Plan can continue to be featured, or some sections of it perhaps, or whatever that will look like. But essentially, because we've realized through the dialogue process that the feminist, the Women, Peace and Security agenda in Canada is very seldom spoken about outside of our common circles. And many activists and organizations in the country do work that could fall under women, peace, and security, but often don't frame it that way. And so what we're hoping that this will also do, and what we were hoping to do with the dialogue process, is also to reach individuals who are working, for example, on gender equality or on certain justice portfolios or on different social justice issues that could fall and do fall under women, peace, and security, but are not framed that way. And so that's one of the purposes of having, for example, background materials, to be able to link certain work that is happening already in certain circles, so that individuals from different communities can also, for one, learn about women, peace, and security, but at the same time, see how their work can be framed that way, and that they can also have their perspectives and lived experiences reflected in the dialogue process. So back to you, Joe.
Thank you. Thank you so much for, again, those insights, just to support us again with really understanding how intentional this process of the dialogue was to ensure that the diversity of voices is something that we got to hear, that we tried as much as possible to make it accessible to everybody as best as we could. But to also support in like a little bit of like information building, right? Like, hey, we're connected. We're all working on the same thing. So thank you for that. I'm now going to introduce the Canada's Women, Peace and Security Ambassador, Jackie O'Neill, who will share her reflections on this report. Now, Jackie, I recognize that we've gone a little over, but what I'm hoping is that we can still give you some time. So maybe I might jump in around like the 2:05 mark and say, well, let's wrap up so that we can get those questions in. But we'd love to hear from you now. So please take it away.
All right. Thanks so much. Please do jump in whenever you feel the need. I could go on about this for a long time, but I will measure it. So thanks so much, Joe, to you and to Katrina and Monique and Sandra and Beth and all of the Women, Peace and Security Network and your CNAP 3 working group. I really want to thank you for, as you said, just now being so intentional and thoughtfully designing these consultations. And to recognize that what so many of you did was on top of your regular quote unquote day jobs. So developing the webinars and the outreach and facilitating and promoting and writing the report. Vraiment, nous tenons vous remercier. So a very warm hello and thanks to everyone for attending this launch today, especially to all of the civil society and Indigenous representatives who gave their time and energy and ideas to make it come to life. I'm joining you from here in Ottawa, so the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, a reflection that's meaningful all year and especially meaningful, I find, for me as we approach September 30th, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So before we get to the substance of the input that we just heard, I just want to spend a moment to talk about this process and its importance. And I think it's really neat to be able to acknowledge that we are at a point here in Canada where we knew we'd need civil society's really meaningful engagement in drafting. I'm sorry, my table is wobbly, so bear with me if through this turbulence. I talk with my hands. So we knew we need your input. We just didn't know the best ways to actually do it. So it was a question of how, not whether or if, which is always a thing to celebrate. And that's really not insignificant. It's really a testament to the ways that we've all worked at this relationship. I think we all genuinely believe that we have a lot to learn and a lot to share. And it's always a great and affirming experience for me when I'm able to talk outside Canada or to other groups within Canada about the relationships that we have as the Canadian government officials working on this with civil society. And just a quick example, I just got back from Bangladesh, and there's a ton of great stuff going on in Bangladesh, a lot of areas for us to learn for our next CNAP. So a really well-timed visit, especially as it relates to dealing with climate disasters and climate emergencies and engaging women within those. They really, unfortunately, have quite a significant amount of experience in those spaces and areas of leadership. And one area that has really stagnated, on the other hand, has been the formulation and the actual bringing to life of their steering committee, they call it, which is like the advisory group that we have in Canada. So government civil society table. They just haven't been able to meet with regularity, to get information to make those meetings meaningful, et cetera. And they've really acknowledged that their National Action Plan implementation has stagnated. And there's just so much that trickles down from not getting that part right, including just disconnected priorities and a lack of accountability, decreased political will because the government is not feeling the pressure from civil society, et cetera. So this relationship that we have is really important, can always be improved, but it's very special. And it's needed certainly in implementation, but really equally importantly during drafting. And of course, as Canada, we have to practice what we preach. We can't expect our missions around the world or those organizing peace processes, et cetera, to put these approaches into practice if we don't do this as well. And it also really helps those of us, and there are many, many of us who are advocates from within the system, so to speak, to have clarity on the priorities of civil society and the interests and the issues that rise to the fore for you, because it shows that we're not just interpreting issues how we see fit, but there's a real constituency domestically and internationally for Canadian leadership on this work. So it's just really helpful to to have this organized in this way and in this helpful format. Nous avons certainement besoin d'entendre de la société civile sur ce que nous faisons bien, ce que doit changer et comment pouvons-nous adapter. Et c'est vraiment important d'élargir la table pour inclure les voix et les perspectives diverses, comme vous venez juste de mentionner, Katrina. Et j'aimerais vraiment souligner l'importance de la première session, cette session Femmes, Paix, Sécurité 101. Women, Peace and Security 101 pour les participants qui ne connaissaient pas l'agenda. And you both just spoke about that. Et c'est vraiment important d'avoir ces ressources, de nous assurer que tout le monde qui travaille sur ces questions connaît notre plan d'action national et connaît les connexions entre ces différents sujets. And I'll say just one last thing on process, and that's that I don't see this as a first step, because I think we've had many engagements over the years that have been informing our thinking on the next plan. But really want to say super clearly that the next National Action Plan isn't being or going to be written in a silo or some dark back room. We're going to keep up the mutual feedback and exchange. And I very much see our responsibility as government as seeking your partnership in a non-extractive manner. And I hope you will continue to keep telling us what we need to hear. So in terms of responses to some of the findings, I won't speak to all of them. I had a lot of thoughts and a lot of responses. I assure you, I've read the full report. Many colleagues are online today in my team and in other teams across Global Affairs Canada and other departments of the government. Many of us have already read the full report shared with us just before this session. We've discussed it with other colleagues, and we're going to keep circulating and discussing it. So I want to make sure you know that just because something's not mentioned today, it's not that it doesn't rise to a level of attention. So just a few reactions and comments. One relates to strengthening the feminist ambition. Comes across very clearly, and I really appreciate the conversation, Joe and Katrina, that you both had about that's a big lift, because it's an overarching perspective set of systems that need to flow from that. And we're still working within the ones that we have, but we have to get closer. Really appreciate comments on operationalizing the intersectionality lens and ensuring a much more clear gender-based analysis plus process, and really making sure, as you pointed out, that intersectionality is fully understood. And we just can't skip over that element when we talk about making it more intersectional and applying these perspectives more. We really have to be extra clear about what we're talking about. And sometimes I think we find that a sense of intersectionality is saying this includes women and this group and this group and this group. And we have to talk about the diversity of women in a range of additional identities, but we don't want to make this plan also just the catch-all of all who are excluded from mainstream processes, because it simply won't be as effective. So we really have to be clear what we mean by intersectionality, and clear that we're a plan that focuses on women in their full diversity. And I really appreciated the idea here of the glossary or the terms and linking to resources and really bringing alive much more gender-based analysis plus analysis and examples of where it's done, and making sure we talk about the harms that the patriarchy imposes on men and boys themselves. And I think sometimes we focus a little bit on, and we need to include men and boys in activities, but in the narration of men and boys and their engagement here, we do need to frame it in a broader way. And of course, the rejection of essentialism, as you referenced earlier, Katrina, really, really important. And in the report, you talk about really being sensitive and careful around arguments of operational effectiveness. And so, this in shorthand really means if you are more inclusive, your results will be better. You'll have a more enduring peace process, a more capable armed forces, et cetera. I hope you've noticed that the government has really been making a conscious effort in the last several years to make sure that we talk about these issues as issues of human rights and fundamental rights. to be included, and that it's about living up to our values to do this. And we can make the case that the results are better. And so, we can do both, but we can't skip to the second one. We can't rely on the second one, and it shouldn't be the basis of any action. I also want to note that it's especially hard to discount that second part, the sort of value, practical value of doing it, especially in this great competition for resources that we all have. And we all really need to be articulating the value of this work in a space that's filled with a lot of very important and noble and human rights based causes. And so I think I'm just flagging that this is going to be something that we have to walk carefully. It's a fine line to make sure that we're making the case that this is a human rights focused issue, that we need to be doing it for that sake alone. And we also need to articulate benefits. So we'll need to walk that line together. Quelques autres points. Un autre point, c'est la cohérence des politiques et de réfléchir de façon stratégique afin de briser les silos et de promouvoir la collaboration entre les ministères. Katrina, you named several calls for justice and plans of action. I won't repeat each of them, but huge priority. And it's been a priority of the government in this office, and personally since I was appointed. Many of you know my mandate as Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security covers all the partners of the National Action Plan. And I think we're getting better at that now. I say just to indicate that we're building on progress at this place. So we've created a number of spaces to do that. So previously we had focal points for the National Action Plan in different departments, but we didn't have a forum for working together, not from disinterest of them or anything else, but just capacity within Global Affairs Canada to actually organize that. We now have quarterly meetings of our focal points in all of the different departments. We now every 2 months have a meeting at the Director General level, including representatives of all of the different partner departments. We have advisory group meetings with you and your colleagues, and they almost always include a broad representation of groups. And then last June, we had something that occurred for the first time in Canada and in almost anywhere else, to my knowledge, that we had a meeting with all of the ministers whose departments have commitments in the National Action Plan. So I think we had 9 ministers plus the head of the RCMP and the chief of the defense staff. So just that senior level folks talking to each other was useful and was a big deal. And so we have to keep systematizing that and keep really being deliberate in that coordination. But I feel like we're moving in a good direction there. And we're designing the process of this next National Action Plan, even within government, to try to address that. So making sure that we're being as deliberate as possible and connecting with the other policies, but also really trying to maximize engagement from each of the departments that are involved so that they feel fully committed and feel a real sense of ownership. I'm always constantly reminded of the African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. That applies to all of us, including many of us in government who are really trying to make this track and make this work. A couple other points before you interrupt, Joe. I'm also watching the time. On providing clarity on the domestic agenda, definitely, again, a really big issue that I'm glad came out in this, especially as it pertains to reconciliation and anti-racism and engaging with veterans and members of the Canadian Armed Forces, and really being as transparent as possible in that. I think that's the direction we're heading, and it's, again, really helpful to have this. Couple last points, maybe I'll just end here, and then I'm going to turn to my colleague Eleanor to really briefly outline the process of next steps so that we're as clear as possible. But just on the strengthening accountability and reporting, I certainly hear you on that and really recognize that the system we've had for the previous CNAP just isn't working enough, and especially it doesn't, for the time and effort that we all put into it, we don't get enough value of it. just a couple quick points on this, on the issue of funding civil society and making sure that we're getting resources out to people. This is a source of enormous frustration for so many of us inside, that we just can't get money out quickly enough and in small enough sometimes batches, basically. And we know we have incredibly cumbersome reporting, and that we stand out in our G7 and G20 colleagues for being a really demanding funder. And we've had a number of conversations with colleagues within global affairs and other areas to say that, addressing this is a feminist foreign policy issue. It's a women, peace and security issue. It's an issue that affects our ability to live our values as we describe them in these plans. And, all of this has so many implications in terms of support to and relationships with youth activists and peace builders and others who just aren't part of large organizations that are used to writing GAC proposals and filling out progress reports, et cetera. We have to change those. We're not going to have it all done by the next plan, but it's so deeply linked. And then, I love the concept of more streamlined reporting and tracking. I'm really eager to bring more specifics to this, because I think I worry a little. This is one of those areas where we all are in agreement on the principle, but we need to confirm that we're really prepared for the trade-offs. And really specifically, if we talk about having perhaps fewer indicators, but ones that we track more rigorously, that we show progress on over time, that we focus on learning, that we're not just counting things, that we're really looking at pivotal types of progress. It's going to mean less volume of reporting in certain ways, but different types. And I really ask for your support as we talk that through and test that out, and make sure that we're not looking at reporting as just a volume type of issue. And this, whatever we do, is designed, I assure you, to make sure that we can be more timely in our reporting as well. So I'm going to, if it's all right, Joe, just turn to Eleanor McNamee very briefly, who's working on the next National Action Plan, and she can review really quickly what the next steps are, and then very, very happy to take anyone's questions.
Yes, I'll keep it brief so that we can get to the Q&A. Thanks so much, Jackie. So what we're planning in terms of next steps. So of course, we're going to share the report with implementing partner departments, just as, we're not creating this in a silo apart from civil society. We're not creating this within a silo within government either. We're really hoping to make sure that all partners, understand what's in the report and take it into consideration while they're developing their implementation plan. So we'll make sure that that happens, including with Veterans Affairs Canada, who's recently confirmed as a new partner for CNAP 3, which is very exciting. So now that you've done all of this amazing, great work, we do need a little bit of time to take a step back and do some deep thinking to make sure that our drafting is reflective of not only what we've heard from you throughout this process, but also what we've been hearing over the last several years of implementing CNAP 2. Yeah, we're gonna take a step back. We're gonna think. We've started drafting the action plan. Our partners are going to start developing their implementation plans. And as Jackie referenced earlier, this is really not a starting point, but it's a continuation of hopefully a deepened partnership with civil society and Indigenous stakeholders as we finish developing the action plan and look toward implementation moving into next year. So all that to say, top line summary is there's a lot of content for us to go through. We need to sit down and make sure that we can figure out what we can do internally, help get that through the bureaucracy, draft the action plan, and then at the right moment, as Jackie said, we're not developing this in a silo. We'll want to come back for a further discussion, continuing mutual feedback, but we'll just want to make sure that that's happening at key moments. So we're not coming back and, discussing or consulting for the sake of discussion, but really allowing there for be space to influence the process as we continue to develop. So we're going to start drafting. We're going to come back to you when we have more questions. And as always, it's an open door on our end. So if anything else comes up, please continue to share. And I will leave it there so you can start the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you, Ambassador O'Neill. I want to just quickly highlight for you, Ambassador O'Neill. In the chat at 2:02, Karen Breek is giving you a thank you, and it's quite detailed, so I think you should take a look at that. And for folks who may have missed it in the chat, it just highlights something that Ambassador O'Neill speaks about, but is also something that's mentioned in the report. There's so much to summarize, which I will not, except to say, right, it sounds like we all have a shared interest, which is human rights. How we get to that is what we're talking about right now. And so on that note, I want to, again, thank Eleanor and Ambassador O'Neill, but I would like to pass the baton over to Sandra. I've already said her name wrong several times. Biskapski Mijanovic, please tell me I said that right. And she is the PhD candidate in gender studies at Western University, studying the experiences of Canadian women that deployed on peacekeeping operations. She's also the network coordinator for Transforming Military Cultures Network at Mount St. Vincent University. And I believe you were the one who wrote the report. You had that lovely task. So without further ado, I will leave it to you to moderate the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. So yes, I contributed to writing the report. And maybe to begin, I'll just quickly mention Karen's question because it's directly related to what Eleanor was just saying. And I don't know, Eleanor, if you're still around to maybe answer it. It just says, is there anything in public already about Veterans Affairs Canada signing on as a partner for CNAP 3? And if not, when will there be?
I can take this one.
Yeah,
If
of course.
We haven't, just lest you all think I give all the hard ones to Eleanor. It hasn't been publicly announced yet. And we're going to have a meeting with them in the next week or two. And so we're going to ask them the best ways, how they want to share that, et cetera. It's, we've been talking about it for weeks. I think I mentioned it in a couple different meetings as something we were on track to get done, et cetera. So, I don't know the answer. It's not officially public yet. And I guess we should err on the side. I'm always learning different things on letting people actually announce it so they can get profile and mileage from it. But we'll ask that plan and get back to you as the network about when that's going to be.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a very concrete question, so I thought I would just begin with that.
Thank you. I could have had a yes or no answer, but I went on.
Yeah, and Ambassador O'Neill and Katrina, I appreciate all the information you.
We are all
okay.
A feminist approach. We do not need people with elevating titles in a workshop. So thank you.
Okay, perfect. I appreciate all the information you've provided. And Katrina, you mentioned a little bit about how there wasn't necessarily consensus on everything during the dialogues. Another thing that came up was that there's a lot of grouping under the terms gender mainstreaming, gender perspectives, security, feminist approaches, gender analysis. And so thinking about that and thinking about what you said, Jackie, about not just collapsing everything under the term intersectionality, what are some concrete ways that intersectionality can and will be operationalized under CNAP 3?
Is that question for me first, or are you asking also our other?
Yeah.
Okay. So again, sorry about this wobbly table. A few different thoughts so far. The report referenced very specifically attention to training of Government of Canada personnel, of course, not only within GAC, but in different elements, other departments, ministers working with Women and Gender Equality Canada to see what training can be most relevant in a national action plan on a women, peace and security context. I think we do need to be more specific when we talk about diversity and when we talk about intersectionality and what it actually means and what it looks like, including how we track it. This really ties in key ways to indicators that we choose and that we value, and making sure that we're both setting people up and training people to track levels of intersectionality or types in different ways that are appropriate and sensitive. Really making sure that we focus on the plus in GBA plus. We hear a lot about how that element gets too quickly dropped or done in too surface a way. So I see all of that as one. We definitely have to keep widening the table. Joe and Katrina talked about how there are many people who are working on issues of security and or women, peace and security and don't necessarily name it that way. So I think we need to engage more with them on these policy questions and get better at engaging with people. This is a constant challenge across, especially at mission levels and internationally. Building in as much flexibility in our programming and plans as possible. So recognizing that sometimes genuinely addressing intersectionality means sometimes it takes more time to do well and thoughtfully. Sometimes it needs resources and making sure that we have funding to make things, physically and in other ways accessible. And then I guess the last thing I'd say is just recognizing that any one group of us doesn't know what we don't know. And so making sure that we're constantly engaging and talking and having diverse circles within our own teams, and then also engaging with the network and other resources to help checking us on our own blind spots. But I'd love if Katrina or Joe and anyone else has anything you'd want to add in terms of practical implications for us.
I have two examples that I did not mention earlier in the conversation today that stood out to me, at least in the dialogue as well, in terms of this question on intersectionality. And one of them is about young women. So often, of course, and this is conversations we've had with you, Ambassador, in the office and several spaces before, but often we see women, peace and security as kind of a big sister to the youth, peace and security space. And so what we hope to see, or what has been discussed in terms of concrete ways to operationalize this intersectionality, is to make those direct links, for example, with the youth, peace and security agenda, and to particularly see where instances of exclusion occur for younger women, or issues of protection, for example. Another example that I want to highlight is with the new action plan on LGBTQIA+ that Canada just adopted at the end of August. That's another example of this intersectional nature. I mean, trans women being recognized as women, queer women, women who identify as lesbian, other types of sexual orientations and identities being also considered in terms of the big issue, of course, of protection, but participation and visibility of them in these spaces. Or queer women in the CAF, for example, what is that experience for them? And so all of this also falls under women, peace and security with that issue, or the question of intersectionality. So just two examples of how we can be concretely intentional.
Yeah, those policy crosswalks, sorry, just to say, they're not sort of just for this coherence for the sake of coherence, but really to bring in a ton of insights that have already been consulted, right? And you both spoke about this too, and we're really sensitive to this, including in these consultations, that we're not asking people the same question that they were asked 6 months ago, 12 months ago, et cetera, but that we're both reading them really carefully. We're building in flexibility and making sure there are those connections. That is, thanks for emphasizing that and saying it really specifically. That's an intersectionality question in some key ways. And we had, when you look at the language and even descriptions of gender, for example, in our current national action plan, the government even describes them differently now. It's sort of just our common text has changed and evolved, and there's a lot that we need to draw from a lot of other policy documents.
I just wanted to add something, because I've kind of had a grin every time you said intersectionality, and talking about this conundrum that we have. And I just keep thinking, like, if you just asked women how they identified, right there, you'd be able to get the answer that you need, instead of having to guess, like, what do we mean? Because again, women, that word is so diverse, and so much is hidden in it, that sometimes just that question, or even when you write the word woman, asking yourself, what does that mean? Right? Something super, super simple, and yet it brings out so much of what we can consider, what the possibilities are.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I'm going to shift gears a little bit, just being aware of the time. And there's a question in the chat from Rosemary Park that perhaps relates a little bit more to the theme of the domestic agenda. And it says, I didn't hear from reporting the dialogues a connecting or tie-in of peace building by Canada's WPS efforts and strengthening Canadian democracy. So I'm not sure if Jackie or Katrina, if you have any thoughts on that question.
Katrina, do you want to speak to that as something that came up or didn't?
So in the dialogue process, what we heard in terms of the implication of women, peace and security, or peace builders in general, with regard to the democratic spaces, is more about civic engagement of women, younger women, women of and all their diversity. However, there is an acknowledgement, or at least there was an acknowledgement in the dialogue process, that Canada is funding efforts to democratize or strengthen democracies abroad as well. For example, with supporting women political leaders in some spaces, women who are peace builders working in strengthening democratic states and societies, or whether that be at a national level elsewhere or in a very basic community level. So that was heard. It wasn't something that was overly discussed, but there was an acknowledgement of some of that work being a WPS framework kind of issue in that lens. But what I would say in terms of that link between peace building and democracy is very clear, but often the women, peace and security agenda, or at least what we heard, wasn't as crystal clear and clear cut as we would have expected. In my own work, working with women political leaders, or having worked previously for a Canadian senator, I have made these links in my life through my personal experiences, but it's not something that came through as much within the dialogue process. And that also speaks to who were able to come to the dialogue process and the need for the continuation of these conversations as well. So I think that that's an excellent question to be bringing up, and we'd love to hear more about this, which is another reason why we're continuing, this conversation and having even the website up to continue to have these inputs.
Yeah. I just chime in that I totally agree, and that I think it will help us to be more explicit in making some of those links, because we are constantly trying to widen this table, and that includes helping people see the connections. And like you, Katrina, have always thought that this work is profoundly related to democracy. I mean, what we're trying to do is prevent and end and war and build peace by making the forces doing that more representative of the will of the people. And that, to me, that's democracy. It's all kinds of different forms, but it's about engaging more people, as we always say, in the decisions that affect their lives. And it's all elements of democratization and focus on democracy. And I think it serves us well, as various other countries, and Canada as well is prioritizing and has a focus on democracy to really spell out these connections.
Another question in the chat is from Daniela, and I'll just read it. It's a little bit long. Given the importance of, I'm guessing, CSW, Commission on the Status of Women, please correct me if I'm wrong, sessions, women, peace and security is not consistently enforced in the agreed conclusions at the end of the sessions. Equally, there's a need for greater effort for the inclusion of civil society preparatory CSW sessions to strengthen the WPS agenda. How does Global Affairs Canada ensure that there's greater engagement and consultations with civil society to ensure the implementation of WPS within the CSW resolutions?
It's a complex question. I mean, there's relationships and conversations and commitments ongoing with our partners at Women and Gender Equality. So at the Department of Wage, which leads on Canada's engagement at the Commission of Status on the Status of Women. But of course that they get input and elements fed in from different departments, including us. As you mentioned, Daniela, the agreed upon conclusions get diluted in many ways. It feels the last several years like we've been running to stand still. Just everything has been focused on just holding on to the language that we'd had agreed to 5 years ago. Because there is this really deliberate pushback. And I think we just have to keep getting more organized and deliberate. The forces that are opposing this, that are subtly and not so subtly using the Commission on the Status of Women to undermine language, to divide traditional allies and relationships. Like, it's a very intentional, insidious approach by those who are working against this. And we have to be just as intentional in our responses back. So working even more and earlier on the Commission of Status of Women, or with our partners at Wage and elsewhere, but not just that, through the Security Council and a whole bunch of other approaches, and really being aware that there are deliberate attacks to undermine civil society's participation, women's participation, making sure that, as we return from COVID, we don't accept things like lack of civil society participation for public health reasons. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that we just, that people can chip away at the full agenda that needs to be included. And we have to be super vigilant and strategic in making sure that we're fighting against those, quite honestly. And I hate framing things like a battle. I don't mean it in a way that in that entire sense, but we do need to make sure that those of us who really care about this are working together both inside Canada and internationally to make sure that we have some really targeted approaches to the attacks against gender equality.
Okay, so thank you so much for that response, Jackie. One of the things that most impressed me from the dialogues process, and something I wouldn't necessarily have thought about, was cybersecurity, especially for women human rights defenders and women peace builders. So I'm curious, both to you, Jackie, and to you, Katrina, what is something that surprised you the most from the dialogue process or from the themes that emerged?
Katrina, you want to go first?
Oh, it's a difficult question because there was a lot of surprising parts of the dialogue, and I agree cybersecurity is one of the themes that stood out that were quite unique or new and emerging in terms of the themes. I think that something that stood out to me in a more surprising way is also this domestication of the agenda. Because when we were having these conversations and when people were coming to the virtual tables, we were hearing a lot of, oh, well, I actually work on gender equality, but I've never heard of women, peace, and security before. Or, and the women, peace, and security civil society space in Canada is very Anglophone. Or at least that's my observation. There are much more Anglophone-based organizations who work in this, or that are national, that work primarily in English. And so I was surprised by the gender equality and gender equity seeking Francophone groups in Quebec and outside of Quebec who were working in this space and wanting to enter or learn more about women, peace, and security. So I guess it was not a response, but more so the participation of certain groups that I found a little bit surprising. I mean, as a Francophone Canadian from the West Coast, it is happily surprising for me. But that's something that I thought was quite unique in terms of broadening the reach and broadening the understanding of what women, peace, and security is in a domestic context.
Absolutely. And I think you're right in the sense that there's groups that don't necessarily identify under the WPS umbrella that would have a lot to offer. So thinking through intersectionality in terms of consultation as well, right? Like, whose voices do we include when thinking about how to implement or pursue the agenda? Thank you. And you, Jackie?
I don't think there was anything that surprised me. I really read the report attentive to how I would react. First of all, I always try to start reading a report like this before I even open the front page or whatever, to remind myself to not be defensive or feel defensive. And I say that not in any way because it merits it, but when it's about work that you're doing ongoingly, you really want the feedback, and you have to make sure you read it with the spirit of really being open to hearing everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But I don't feel like I had surprises. And I think that's a reflection on the collaboration with the network to date. We've had a lot of interactions. We read your reports on our reports. We have advisory group meetings. Certainly whenever I'm traveling, I make a point of meeting with civil society around the world in countries where we're working and joining virtual events internationally. Twitter is a giant cesspool in many ways, but if you follow enough great women peace builders and activists, people are surfacing issues. So In some ways, I'm surprised I wasn't surprised, but I'm also very happy that I wasn't surprised, because if I had been, I think that in itself would have potentially been a problem in terms of just being disconnected from some of the biggest issues. So don't mean to come off obnoxiously in that sense, that I knew everything that would be raised, but there weren't points flagged that were ones we hadn't heard before, which is a great thing.
Great, thank you so much both. I'm aware of the time and we're really running short on time, so I'll end it there, even though I have so many other questions that I could ask just from myself, and I'll leave it with you, Joe.
Thank you, Sandra. So, as we close, first of all, like, round of applause and thanks to, to Katrina, to Jackie, to Sandra, to Monique, to the ASL interpreters, to the French and English interpreters, to the CNAP3 working group. Hello, because like all of this is possible because of the joint efforts of all of these people who put this together. So like, a deep round of applause coming from me, and I'm hoping from everyone else. And as we end today, one thing I want to share with you folks is like the report will be launched momentarily or shortly. Again, please support the engagement on social media by using the hashtag with WPS Dialogue FPS. And as we close, two things. One, this is part of a continuing process, so please stay tuned because there will be more. And two, as I finish this, as we wrap it up, what I'm taking away from this is engagement leads to clarity, right? Only through engagement, only going through these processes can we actually get some more clarity about where we need to go. And from that point, we can be intentional. And, to just build off of what, Jackie was talking about, it's like, let's look at the material we're getting and the feedback we're receiving, with that air of curiosity, right? Because we all have that shared interest to ensure that everyone is able to enjoy their human rights. And so with that, thank you all for your participation, for your questions that we can get all to, and I wish you a lovely rest of your day. Take care.